It was just another ordinary evening, the kind of night that seemed so mundane it could easily slip by without anyone taking notice. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the otherwise still apartment. I'd just finished my shift at the local bookstore, my usual stop on the way home for a quiet, peaceful evening. The air was cool as I closed the door behind me, and I locked it without thinking twice. The faint scent of fresh rain drifted through the cracks in the window, a small reminder that even the simplest moments can feel peaceful. His mouth twitched. I settled into my favorite chair by the window, a worn armchair that had been with me for years. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 7:45 p.m., a perfect time to unwind with a book, or perhaps indulge in one of my guilty pleasures, pizza. The thought of a warm, cheesy slice immediately brought a smile to my face. The comfort of a hot meal on a quiet night, alone in the peace of my own home. I picked up my phone again and opened the pizza app. As I scrolled through the menu, my mind wandered to the usual choices. Pepperoni? No, I had that last time. Maybe something new? My fingers hovered over the screen, and after a brief moment of indecision, I finally chose a classic, a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese. Simple, satisfying. The order was placed. While I waited for the confirmation, I leaned back in the chair and looked out the window. The street below was quiet, the kind of stillness that only a small neighborhood could provide. No one seemed to be in a hurry, and the world felt calm. It was the kind of evening that could lull anyone into a false sense of security. The gentle tapping of my phone screen was the only interruption. The confirmation came through. Estimated delivery time, 30 minutes. I felt a slight sense of anticipation, the way one does when they know they're about to indulge in something small but deeply comforting. I set the phone down and went to the kitchen to grab a drink, taking my time as I waited. The sound of my footsteps echoed in that space, a gentle reminder of how alone I was in that space. Alone, but content. I took a sip of water, then returned to the chair by the window. My eyes drifted over the peaceful scene outside. There was something almost hypnotic about the way the streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that stretched across the road. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure move at the end of the block, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the empty street. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the fading light in my tired eyes. The next 30 minutes passed slowly. I lost track of time, lost in the quiet hum of the apartment. When the doorbell finally rang, I stood up with a start, surprised by how much time had passed. I glanced at the clock. 8:15 p.m. That was fast, I thought. Maybe the pizza place had fewer deliveries tonight. I made my way to the door and, without thinking, unlocked it. I swung it open, expecting to see the familiar face of the delivery driver. But there was no one standing on the other side.
"It was in place,"
the woman said in a strange tone. Instead, a small box sat on the doorstep, the pizza tucked neatly inside. I looked around, expecting to see the delivery driver somewhere nearby, but the street was empty. The soft glow of the streetlights flickered, casting shadows that stretched long across the pavement, but there was no sign of anyone. I frowned, unsure of what to make of the situation. I'd never had a delivery left like this before. It was strange, but not exactly alarming. Maybe the driver had simply dropped it off and left in a hurry. I bent down and picked up the box, feeling the warmth of it through the cardboard. It smelled delicious, fresh, cheesy, with just a hint of pepperoni. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the delivery itself, but the strange emptiness that seemed to hang in the air. It felt different somehow. A sense of unease crept over me, but I pushed it aside, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. I set the pizza box on the kitchen counter and opened it. The smell hit me again, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. It was a perfect pizza, golden crust, bubbling cheese, and just the right amount of pepperoni. I grabbed a slice and took a bite, the warmth and flavor instantly comforting me. But as I chewed, something about the night still lingered in the back of my mind. Something felt wrong. It wasn't the pizza, nor the delivery. It was the stillness in the air, the odd, almost oppressive silence that seemed to stretch across the room. I glanced around, the unease creeping back into my chest. I turned toward the window, my eyes scanning the street below. Nothing. Just the same quiet, empty street I'd seen before. But that strange feeling of being watched was growing stronger, gnawing at me, like a shadow that I couldn't quite shake. The unease continued to build as I ate, the pizza now cold in my hands. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the night felt increasingly off. The silence in the apartment felt thicker, almost oppressive, as if the very air was heavy with some unseen presence. I glanced toward the window again, expecting to see nothing more than the darkened street. But this time, there was something different. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision, just beyond the street lamp's glow. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was just the flickering light playing tricks on my eyes, but as I stared longer, the shape became more distinct. It wasn't just a shadow, it was the figure of someone, or something, standing motionless at the end of the block. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned away from the window, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a person walking. Maybe it was a tree branch swaying in the wind, or maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. The figure had been there too long, standing perfectly still, as if it was waiting for something. I set the pizza down on the counter, suddenly no longer hungry. The taste lingered in my mouth, but the unease had completely overridden any comfort it had provided. My fingers hovered over the phone again, but I hesitated. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would I call for something like this? A friend? A family member? It wasn't as though I could explain the strange feeling in my chest, the quiet fear that had settled into my bones. I paced the room for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling. I flicked on the lights, checked the locks on the doors, and even glanced out the window again. The street below was still empty. No sign of the figure. It was as though they had vanished into the night, but that sense of being watched remained. I couldn't let it go. The feeling that something was just beyond my reach, waiting, lurking in the shadows. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair, determined to put my mind at ease. If I went outside, I reasoned, I'd see that it was just my imagination. I would walk around the block, see that there was nothing to worry about, and then I could go back inside and forget this ever happened. At the center of the park, the square was full of sun and tall trees. With a deep breath, I opened the door. The cool air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the apartment. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every sound, every shift in the atmosphere. My footsteps echoed as I stepped onto the porch, and I glanced around the yard. The shadows of trees stretched across the grass, and the street light at the end of the block flickered, casting an eerie glow. I walked down the steps, my heart racing in my chest, and turned the corner toward the street. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced to my left, to my right. Nothing. The street was as empty as it had been earlier. I told myself to relax, to breathe, but the nagging sensation that something wasn't right refused to leave me. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it again. The figure, standing in the exact same spot at the end of the block, still unmoving. This time, it was closer. Too close. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the figure, unable to move. The streetlight above it flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something, or someone, standing next to the figure, just barely out of view. My breath caught in my throat, but when the light stabilized, the figure was alone, just standing there, as though waiting. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being pulled toward it, not physically, but mentally. The more I looked, the more I felt like I had to approach, to understand what was happening, but my feet refused to move. My legs were locked in place, as though my body knew better than my mind. There was something wrong with this, something very wrong. A faint sound broke the silence, footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, expecting to see someone coming up the street, but there was nothing. I turned back to the figure, but this time it was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around frantically, scanning the empty street, but there was no sign of the figure, no shadow, no movement, just the quiet night, as though it had never been there. I quickly walked back to the house, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I reached the door, I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder once more. The street was empty, silent, normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something was watching me, just beyond the corner of my vision, waiting for me to look away. I closed the door behind me with a soft click, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to calm my racing heart. The night felt too quiet, too still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I didn't know what had happened out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back outside tonight. Whatever had been lurking on the street was not something I wanted to confront. The silence of the apartment felt suffocating now. I could still hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, but everything else was eerily quiet. No cars driving by, no distant sounds of laughter or footsteps on the sidewalk. Just me, alone in the dim light of my living room, trying to shake the lingering sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I sat down on the couch, reaching for the remote to turn on the TV, desperate for some distraction. But the screen flickered to life and immediately cut to static. A crackling noise filled the room, loud and sharp, like the hiss of an old radio struggling to tune in. Confused, I pressed the power button again, but the static only grew louder. I tried turning the volume down, but it didn't help. It felt as though the static was surrounding me, closing in, suffocating the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped. The screen blinked and I was no longer staring at the fuzzy mess of static. Instead, I was staring at the delivery guy. My heart skipped a beat, my stomach dropping as I saw his face. He was standing at the edge of the screen, his expression frozen in place. The same delivery guy from earlier, the one who had brought my pizza. He stood there, staring into the camera with wide, unblinking eyes. His lips were slightly parted, as if he was about to say something, but no sound came from the TV. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, certain I was seeing things, but when I looked again, the delivery guy was still there. His eyes were locked on mine, his face pale, his hair matted with sweat. That was when I saw all of the delivery trucks. It had been the same color before. When I asked point blank, I stood up, a chill creeping up my spine. What the hell was going on? This couldn't be real. There was no way the delivery guy was actually in my TV. It was just a coincidence. Maybe some strange broadcast glitch. Or a prank. But why did he look so off? Suddenly his lips moved. His voice crackled through the static, low and distorted, but I could just make out the words. Don't answer the door again. The words sent a shock of cold through me, and I took a step back, my mind racing. The delivery guy's image was still frozen on the screen, but his message hung in the air like a warning, one I couldn't shake. What was he trying to tell me? What did he mean? I glanced nervously at the door. I hadn't heard anyone else outside, and there had been no knocking, no delivery. So why was his message coming through now? And why did he look so terrified? I wanted to reach for the remote again, to turn off the TV and erase the image of his face from my mind. But I couldn't move. It was as though his eyes were pulling me in, forcing me to watch, forcing me to listen. The image of the delivery guy flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something moving in the background. A shadow, a shape just beyond his shoulder. It was hard to make out, but it looked like something was standing behind him. Something tall, something dark. The figure was too large to be another person, and it seemed to stretch unnaturally, like it didn't belong in the frame at all. The shadow seemed to move closer, looming over the delivery guy's shoulder, but when I blinked, it was gone. The screen was once again just static. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I reached for the remote, trembling, and turned off the TV. The room plunged into silence, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was still there, hanging in the air, just beyond the edge of my awareness. I felt like I wasn't alone. Maybe. A sudden knock at the door broke through the tension, sharp and loud. I froze. It couldn't be, not after what I had just seen, not after the warning. I didn't want to answer the door. My instincts screamed at me to stay away, to ignore it. But curiosity tugged at me, pulling me toward the door like a magnet. I didn't want to know what was on the other side, but the idea of just ignoring it seemed impossible. I had to know. Slowly, I walked toward the door, my footsteps sounding too loud in the stillness. Each step felt like an eternity, the seconds stretching into minutes. I hesitated before I reached for the handle, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, standing in the doorway, was the delivery guy. But this time, his face was even paler, his eyes wide with fear, and his mouth was open, as if he was about to say something. His hands were trembling, holding a pizza box, but his body was stiff, rigid, like he couldn't move. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. You were just on my TV. He didn't answer. The air between us felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the delivery guy, unable to make sense of what was happening. How was he here? What was going on? My mind raced, each thought crashing into the next, none of them making sense. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, holding the pizza box, his wide eyes fixed on me, his face drained of color. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, a sense of wrongness so intense that it almost made me step back, close the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't. Something about his presence was off. He wasn't the same as he had been earlier. The fear in his eyes was real, palpable, and it was beginning to infect me. I felt it creeping into my own chest, settling like a weight on my heart. Are you okay? I asked, my voice shaky, trying to make sense of it all. He didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on mine, his hands trembling slightly, as though he were trying to hold himself together. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, as though he was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. I swallowed hard, trying to force myself to speak again, to ask what was going on, but the words wouldn't come. The longer I stood there, the more it felt like the world was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. It said that if I glanced at the pizza box in his hands. It was the same one he had brought earlier. The same box, the same logo, everything exactly as it had been. But there was something different about it now. Something about the way it sat in his hands, as if it were too heavy for him to hold. It didn't make sense. "Are you going to leave it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want it." He blinked, as if he were hearing me for the first time, and his lips parted as though he was about to say something. But before he could speak, there was a sudden noise, a loud, sharp scraping sound from behind him. It came from the darkness of the hallway, and it was so unexpected that I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. The delivery guy's eyes darted toward the sound, and his expression shifted, his fear growing, deepening. His face went pale, his body stiffening, as though he were about to run. But he didn't move. His eyes were wide, his mouth trembling. I stepped back instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest. "What is that? What's happening?" But he didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, staring into the hallway behind him. His eyes were wide, frantic, as though he could see something that I couldn't. I took another step back, wanting to slam the door shut, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on his, watching the fear spread across his face like a shadow. Bracton's eyes clouded, and then just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The hallway was silent again. I held my breath, listening for any sound, any sign that something was wrong. But there was nothing. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the quiet, oppressive silence of the apartment. The delivery guy's gaze flickered back to me, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he had seen something horrible. His lips trembled, and his voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "Don't open the door again," he said, his words low and strained. "Please, don't open the door." Before I could respond, he turned quickly, nearly dropping the pizza box in his haste, and began to walk away. He didn't look back. He didn't say anything else. He just walked down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, staring after him, my mind spinning. What had just happened? Why had he acted like that? What was in the hallway that had made him so terrified? I closed the door slowly, my hand shaking as I turned the lock. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and the feeling of dread that had settled over me earlier was now back, 10 times stronger. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know who the delivery guy was, or what had caused him to react like that. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going near that door again. Whatever was on the other side, whatever had just happened, it was beyond my understanding, and I wasn't going to risk finding out. I backed away from the door, my eyes still locked on it, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the hallway outside was quiet, the shadows deep and still. The pizza box was still sitting on the counter, untouched. The hours passed in a strange, heavy silence. I tried to shake off the unease that clung to me, but it was no use. Every little sound in the apartment seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the creaking of the old wood beneath my feet. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Something had changed. I sat in the living room, the TV on, though I wasn't really watching it. My mind kept drifting back to the delivery guy. What had he meant when he said not to open the door again? What had he seen that had terrified him so much? I glanced over at the pizza box sitting on the counter. It felt like it was watching me, like it was waiting for me to do something, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I had no idea what was inside anymore, but the thought of eating it, of touching it, made my stomach turn. There was a knock at the door. I froze. My heart stopped for a second. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak beneath me. My eyes flicked to the pizza box once more, but this time it was different. It looked wrong. The box was no longer closed. The lid was slightly open, as though someone had pried it open just enough to peek inside. But I hadn't touched it. I hadn't opened it. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. There was no way it could have opened on its own, right? But then again, the whole situation had felt impossible from the beginning. The knock came again, louder this time. I moved toward the door, my feet reluctant to carry me forward. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to lock myself in the bathroom and hide until morning. But I couldn't do that. I had to know. I had to find out what was happening. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the doorknob. The hallway outside was dark, the shadows long and deep, stretching unnaturally across the floor. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, just a crack. At first I saw nothing. No one was there. Just the empty, silent hallway stretching out in front of me. The light from the apartment flickered across the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. But then I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the far end of the hallway. It was too quiet to make out the words, but it sounded wrong, distorted, like the voice was coming from underwater or from behind a thick layer of glass. I didn't want to open the door any wider, but I had to know. I had to see. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the hallway. There was nothing, just the shadows. But then I saw it. Something small, almost invisible, moving just at the edge of the darkness. A figure, a shape. It was standing at the end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows, but it was there. I could feel it. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to close the door, to lock myself away and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. The whispering sound grew louder, more distinct now. It was definitely a voice, though I still couldn't make out the words. It sounded like it was coming from the figure, but it wasn't quite right. The voice was garbled, distorted, like a recording playing at the wrong speed. Suddenly, the figure moved. It wasn't a human shape. It was too wrong, too disjointed. The way it shifted, jerking unnaturally, didn't make sense. It was as if it were glitching, flickering in and out of existence. Lance snapped the binocular back in place and pressed the broad barrel to the snow. My breath caught in my throat. My whole body screamed for me to run, but I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure moved closer, its presence growing more oppressive with each step. The whispering was now a low, guttural sound, like someone choking on their words, trying to speak but unable to. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The hallway was empty again. The shadows were still, the whispering silence once more. I slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. My heart was racing, my body trembling, but I couldn't look away from the door. I couldn't move. What had I just seen? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I glanced back toward the kitchen. The pizza box was still there, the lid slightly ajar, but it wasn't the same as before. Now it looked wrong. The shadows in the room seemed to crawl toward it, as if they were drawn to it, feeding off it. And the air around the box felt colder, heavier. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't over. The room felt colder now, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the background, but it was a hollow sound, like it was coming from a distance. My hands were trembling, and I couldn't seem to focus on anything for more than a few seconds. Every little noise, every movement in the corner of my vision felt like it was pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand. I took a few slow steps backward, trying to make sense of what had happened. The figure in the hallway, it couldn't have been real. Could it? The distortion, the glitching. It had felt like something out of a nightmare, but it was too vivid, too real. I glanced toward the kitchen again, my eyes unwillingly drawn to the pizza box. The shadows around it had deepened, thickening, as if they were alive, creeping toward it, feeding off its presence. And then I saw it. The pizza box wasn't just a jar. It was open now, wide enough for me to see inside.
The Virgin of Given can much help get new movement into him, Marg said.
I couldn't breathe. Inside the box was a slice of pizza, but it wasn't just any slice. It was wrong. The cheese had congealed into a dark, unnatural color, almost like dried blood. The sauce was thick, clotted, a deep crimson that spread across the box in streaks, like it was trying to escape. But the worst part, the slice was moving. It was twitching, like something was alive within it. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. My legs were shaky, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the box. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't something I should be seeing. I turned toward the door, ready to bolt, but then I heard a soft knock. A single, deliberate knock at the door. I froze. The knock was followed by a voice, low, muffled, but unmistakable. Open the door. I didn't recognize the voice, but it felt like it was coming from inside my own head, as if the words were being whispered directly into my thoughts. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, and all I could do was listen to the voice. Open the door, it's time. The words were chilling, and the air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. I turned slowly, my gaze shifting back to the pizza box. The twitching slice was gone. In its place was something else, something darker. The shadows around it had grown thicker, as if the darkness itself had poured out of the box. And then I saw it. A hand, thin and pale, emerging from the pizza box, as though it had been hiding inside the slice all along. The fingers were long, bony and twisted, with dark, jagged nails that scraped against the sides of the box as they pulled themselves out. The hand twitched and jerked, moving in unnatural ways, as if it didn't belong to a living thing. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, I couldn't even scream. The hand slowly rose, followed by the rest of the figure, something that was more shadow than flesh, a thing that seemed to warp and flicker in the dim light of the apartment. It was like it was made of darkness itself, a shape that didn't make sense, something that couldn't exist in the world I knew. But it was real. It was standing there in front of me. And then it spoke, its voice a garbled whisper that seemed to echo in every corner of the room. Now, you will understand. Before I could react, the figure lunged forward, its movements a blur, its twisted hand reaching for me. The room spun, the shadows closing in, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing. The room was silent. Too silent. I could still feel the cold in the air, but the darkness had lifted. The pizza box was gone. The figure was gone. It was like none of it had ever happened. I slowly pushed myself up, my mind reeling. Was it all just a dream? Had I imagined it? But then I saw the slice of pizza on the counter. It was untouched, perfectly normal. The cheese was golden, the sauce red but untainted, and beside it there was a small note. Thank you for your order. I stared at the note for a long time, my heart racing. It didn't make sense. How had it all ended like this? What had happened to the figure, The hand. The shadows. I glanced around the room. Everything seemed normal now. Too normal. The world felt like it was trying to convince me that nothing had changed, that I was just imagining things. But I knew better. I had seen it. I had felt it. And whatever it wasn't over.